got deported. It was a couple of days before my 21st birthday, and I had just come home from a ski trip in the mountains with my college friends. I remember pulling my suitcase up the stairs, and just as I pushed open the door to my childhood bedroom, I heard my dad's voice from behind. That's when he said 4 words I'll never forget. "You don't have papers." In his hand, he had a letter from the Department of Homeland Security. It was a notice to appear in immigration court. The letter said that I had overstayed my visa and now had to go before a judge who could issue me a 10-year bar from re-entering the only home that I have ever known. How do you prepare yourself for the realization that you are less than legal? That suddenly you're an unwelcome guest in your own home, facing eviction. See, that moment of truth sent me flying into a new chapter of my life that I never wanted or imagined I could ever be a part of, because I had heard about those illegal aliens, how they're criminal, they're poor, they take our jobs, they don't even speak English. But my dad's words thrust me headfirst into a reality that wasn't mine until suddenly it was. Because suddenly that illegal alien was me. Today, I want to take you on that journey of transformation to help you understand what it's like to be undocumented in America. My story begins in 1995 when I was just a 5-year-old Canuck living a couple hundred miles north of the Montana border in Canada. See, my dad wanted to pursue the American dream, and so he went to Florida. And what he found there was a $5 an hour job working behind the counter of a hunger relief agency called Dunkin' Donuts. That's where my American dream began. You see, the American dream it's what you tell your kids, or maybe what your parents tell you, that if you just study hard and if you eat all your vegetables, you can be anything you want when you grow up. It's the idea that if you just work hard, you can do great things. And our founding fathers believed in the American dream. Did you know none of our founders were born American? They all became American over time. In fact, many of our nation's immigrants were paperless, but they sacrificed and they worked and they dreamed big dreams. And that's what made it possible for their children and their children's children to get some truly extraordinary opportunities. See, in my family, when we got here, I was 6 years old in 1996, and my dad got me a visa to come here legally. I can still remember walking into my first grade class and not recognizing what the Pledge of Allegiance was. I had just never heard it before. I can remember trading in my snow boots for cowboy boots, and I can remember how in elementary school I spent 5 years learning how to square dance, which is not a skill I could use outside of Texas. But my parents really loved it here, and they believed in the American dream, and they wanted to stay. So they hired an attorney, they filed the paperwork, they paid the fees, and then they waited for an approval that just never came. We never imagined our attorney would file the paperwork late, or that an employer would refuse to sign a document in the final stages of a years-long application process. Things went wrong, but we played by the rules, and 18 years later, we have nothing to show for it, not even papers. See, the immigration system today is very different from what it was when my family first got here 20 years ago. Back then, there were 5 million undocumented immigrants. Today, that number has more than doubled to 12 million. About half of that population came here without authorization. There's no record of them having crossed the border. But the other half, including myself, we came here legally. Over time, things like 9/11 made immigration laws more complex. So as we waited for our applications to process, our visas expired, and so did our driver's licenses. That's how we became undocumented. And that's really when our life of invisibility began. You see, living in this country without a valid government-issued ID card is hard. Because while my parents can't renew their driver's licenses, they still pay car insurance. They can't open a savings account, can't get a credit card, can't sign up for Obamacare, and forget retirement without Social Security. My parents have a 20-year track record of paying income tax, sales tax, property tax, Medicaid tax, Medicare tax, Social Security tax. Yet we are still undocumented. Growing up, I felt the burden of being undocumented in so many other ways. I felt it when I took out 6 figures in loans to pay for college. because I didn't qualify for federal financial aid. I felt it when my parents wouldn't let me study abroad because what they knew at the time and what I didn't was that if I left the country, I wouldn't be allowed back in. I think it's scary knowing that your status is a secret, that you always have to hold, and that you always have to fear. So we hide in plain sight. We drive below the speed limit. We stop at every yellow light. And we try to stay positive, but it's hard to keep your head down and your chin up at the same time. We never imagined living in fear is the price we'd pay for the American dream. Because you see, as taxpayers, we spend a lot of time and a lot of money jailing people who honestly just came here to work. Right now, there are about 34,000 people who sit behind bars in federal and private prisons, and it's because they're missing a single sheet of paper. And this mass incarceration has fundamentally changed our communities. In poor communities and communities that are saturated with migrant populations, there's this sense of hopelessness that's sort of resulted from these kinds of outcomes. And undocumented people aren't the only ones who bear the brunt of the impact. Right now, 5,000 US citizen children are in the foster care system because their parents have been deported or detained. That's the sad reality in communities across the United States. And these patterns are unfolding right here in our own backyard. See, about a year ago, I was at a technology conference when I got a call from my mom. It was that phone call, you know, the one that changes everything. She said that my dad had been picked up by officers and was being transported to a detention center about 2 hours south of San Antonio. I was completely stunned. But in that moment, I could only do two things. So first, I ripped up my student loan check and I rewrote it to the Department of Homeland Security for bail. Then I went down there to pick him up. And when I got to the detention center, what I saw was a concrete complex surrounded by a 10-foot-high security fence that was topped with razor wire. There were security cameras everywhere. And around the perimeter of the detention center, there were officers who were driving around in white vans, and they were basically picking up anyone who tried to escape. This place was truly the kind of place where you're given a dirty white jumpsuit and where you're known by your serial number. And because it's not the most hospitable place, there was no waiting room for visitors. So for the next 4 hours, we waited outside in the parking lot. And what I found in the parking lot were some really interesting people because we came from such different backgrounds, yet somehow we appeared to share the same fate. I met a bride-to-be whose fiancé had been jailed 40 days earlier because he had forgotten to put his turn signal on while he was driving. You see, for Americans, if that was the case, you'd probably get a ticket, you might get a warning, and then you'd be on your way. But for undocumented people, the consequences are far greater. I also met a man who had finally collected the $40,000 needed to bail his son-in-law out of jail. He said his son-in-law had been in the country for 30 years at that point. But what was really sad to see was when his son-in-law walked out of that detention center, because he couldn't have been more than 32, maybe 33 years old, and it was so clear to me that he had spent his entire life here. This was his home. Stories like his are not uncommon. About 60% of the undocumented population has lived here for more than a decade. 25% of the undocumented population, they've been here for more than 20 years. That's 3 million people, and 20 years for me is a lifetime. I think despite these numbers, we tend to create these divisions in our mind between the good kind of immigrant and the bad kind of immigrant. I think we estimate the value of people based on their legal status. But being undocumented is a circumstance. It's not a value judgment. Last year, I was at South by Southwest, the festival, here in Austin, and I went to a panel on immigration reform. One of the questions that came up was, what do we do about the 12 million people who are living in the shadows? And a senator responded, and he said, you know, I wish those immigrants would just go to the back of the line. So when the floor opened up for a Q&A, I took the mic, and I said, Senator, what does the line look like? He didn't have an answer for me. Because the truth is, there is no line. It has to do with how old you were when you got here, what country you came from, what occupation you work in. But for people like me who were brought here as children, there is no line. And that's why immigration reform is so important to so many people, because it gives them a chance to get in line. I think that there is a fundamental need in our community to change the way that we think about immigrants, because the way that we think about immigrants impacts the way that we talk about immigrants. The way that we talk about them impacts the way that we treat them. The way that we treat them has led us to a point in this country where 12 million people are living in the shadows. That's the population of New York City and Los Angeles combined. 12 million people is a massive number. I may be one of them, but my dad had the guts to step into total darkness with nothing but big hopes and a bold dream when he made that decision to come here legally 20 years ago. And I'm glad he did, because even though no one asked my permission or my opinion to bring me here when I was just 6 years old, I know that I'm American in every single way except by virtue of birth. I think we all owe a debt to those who came before us, because somewhere in your lineage, someone took a giant leap of faith to come to America, and they made it possible for you to achieve your dreams. I think if we can look to the sacrifices that our ancestors made, then only then can we truly understand what is possible when we make the American dream accessible to everyone. Thank you. Thank you.